Okay, so hello everybody. This is Alicia. I'm part of Bruegel, yes, I'm senior, I think, senior research fellow at Bruegel. It's really very nice to meet you all here today. There's quite a few people online to talk about something as important, I believe, as China's role in the UN and what it means for Europe. That's what we're going to cover today. We have a very tight agenda. We have many speakers for an hour and a half, and lots of people probably interested in asking questions, so we're going to go straight to the point. We're going to have Jeromin Zettelmeier, our director, Bruegel director, to make a few introductory remarks on this topic. Thank you, Jeromin.
Okay, so the agenda is so tight that I should probably have cut myself. But I just want to say it's, the broader significance of this topic is that if we want to develop sensible policies vis-à-vis China, we need to understand informal channels of influence, right? That's the basic point. And so they could be in many areas. They could be vis-à-vis other political bodies outside China, they could be vis-à-vis the private sector, or they could be through the UN. The UN arena is an important one because the so-called Global South is critical to decarbonization efforts. It's critical to supplies of critical raw materials and so forth. And so one way to look at these informal channels of influence is through UN documents and through UN votes. And so as far as I'm aware, this is the first paper that does both in a systematic way, and that's what we'll discuss today. So that's your motivation. I hope I didn't steal it from you. And have a great workshop. I'll stick around for a little bit and then but I will not moderate. So first of all, there isn't a seventh chair for me. And in addition, Alicia does this very, very well. So good luck.
So I thought, yeah, can you hear me? Maybe not. It's fine, Alicia. Okay. Somebody else. Yeah. Okay, you can hear me now. Just to start, we're going to really rush it through the presentation of a policy brief that anyway, you should be able to read today at some point in the afternoon. It should be published. So the good news is that we can rush it because you can actually read it very, very soon. And I want to thank my co-authors who basically they had to bear with me for I don't know how many weeks working on this topic. Pauline Weil and Theo Storella, they're going to make really the big part of the presentation. I'm only going to do a very short intro, hopefully less than 5 minutes. If the slides can be uploaded, I rely on them because I don't even know whether the slides are there, but they are. So, there you go. I just want to, I think we don't need much to really motivate why we need to do this. I think for a long time we've heard about China's influence in the UN as, something magic in a way, lots of committees, standards, you name it. But I think we really wanted to do this more thoroughly, more analytically, which is exactly what we do in this paper. Next slide, and you'll see a little bit of what this means. We cover, as Jeromin said, narratives, but we also cover actual votes. There's many other ways to look at the influence of the UN that many have done, like committees, like standards, like budget, how much money. But we think these really are more the actual outputs, especially votes. So we want to focus on that. We also need to realize that the UN is a special animal because this is a place where literally it looks like the EU in a way, a country vote. Yeah, we like that. So the UN is exactly the same, and we actually focus on those roll votes, meaning those where each country has a vote. And I think in the spirit of what the UN really is about. So you would already imagine that a country that is developing a nation should do quite well because, you know, it's the spirit of the UN. And in fact, that's in a way what we find, which is not necessarily China because of China, but mostly we find a lot of correlation in income per capita. You'll see that later. So nothing really too dramatic from our end. Next one. So the history is clear, but I think it's important for those who are not very aware that we do, of course, start our analysis on 1971 because something quite big happened. I mean, living in Taiwan, I can tell you that that was a big one for Taiwan. And it does show, you know, that there's been this kind of breakthrough, China as, you know, that big newcomer, P5, you name it. I mean, it's really quite telling in a way that what we find, that China was actually always quite important. I think that's the main finding. It's not new. And that has a lot to do with the history of China in the UN. Next slide. There is a lot of research on this, but interestingly, there's less research on what we're covering, which is narratives and votes. There's a lot on budget, on committees, on standards. So we wanted to focus on a little bit what is still today a little bit of a gap in the literature. And that is what you will see. Next slide, Pauline will cover the actual deeds, the votes, and Theo will cover the words, the narratives. And they should align, but it's very hard to see how they align, which is, of course, Jeromin's main comment to our paper, rightly so, but it is quite hard to see the you know, whether narratives help the votes or not. Maybe it's too early, to be frank, because some of the narratives are quite recent, as you'll see in a moment. I'm not going to talk about the literature. I'm going to spare you from this because we want to go to real action, our paper, and I'm going to give the floor to Theo first on the objective, the data, the methodology, and then the actual words.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I guess we should probably get started with the data source. And so when we're talking about all these documents that were part of our review, we started from the UN Digital Library. Now, this is a searchable repository, over 1.5 million documents of several different types that come from the United Nations and are openly accessible. And we found about 2,500 that mentioned Chinese global initiatives as well as Western ones that we found useful for comparison. And so through this, we were able to collect and then process and analyze a whole host of documents that spoke about Chinese initiatives pertaining to certain topics and pertaining to certain countries that were linked to those initiatives. For deeds, Pauline will be able to tell us more, but basically we were dealing with a database that was compounded by Wooten et al., which traced all votes that have been taken at the United Nations, roll call votes since a certain date, and has been updated all the way until June 2024. From 1971, we found about 5,200 or so United Nations roll call votes that were useful for our analysis. But moving right along to the center of my analysis was our methodology for the initiatives themselves and how we used Python and several packages within it to be able to, one, process the data into something that was analyzable, and then to use all kinds of different packages from Python to find countries linked to initiatives, taking these sometimes very lengthy documents and analyzing them paragraph by paragraph to see where do these initiatives appear in United Nations documents, and then within those paragraphs, within the context of that initiative, what countries are mentioned? What does that tell us? That country is mentioned right next to, for example, the Global Development Initiative or the Global Civilization Initiative. From there, we're trying to figure out the topics of the documents themselves. So when one of these initiatives is mentioned, what is the document surrounding it really talking about? And for that, we were able to use large language models that are produced in part by Meta, the BART model, for those of you that are familiar with this stuff, that's basically able to, when given keywords, analyze a document and say there is high probability that this document pertains to this topic. So for example, if I say that I want to see if these documents pertain to furniture, this program would be able to tell that, oh, this document contains the word chair, the word table. It's probably a document about furniture, except in our case, obviously, we're talking about humanitarianism. We're talking about human rights. We're talking about security. We're talking about development. These are the topics that we were able to figure out across 2,500 documents, just what was being discussed in each of these documents in the context of these initiatives. For votes, we were using a methodology that basically ascribes a degree of alignment to each country's vote as it is cast in the United Nations, and alignment to a country of interest. In our case, this was China, and for comparison, the United States. We're trying to figure out how aligned are voting members of the United Nations to Chinese voting patterns. So you can see the table above us that basically shows that for country X, when China votes yes on a motion, if country X votes yes as well, then it'll receive a score of 1. If it votes no, it'll receive a score of 0. And if it abstains, then it would receive a score of 0.5. Now, what this creates is over thousands of votes, averages, what we call alignment averages. These are scores over time that show the degree of alignment that countries have with China or with the United States. And we'd be happy to answer more questions about this, but moving right along to the results that we got, I want to tell you guys a little bit about Chinese initiatives. So we surveyed 5 of them, sorry. One was the Shared Future of Mankind, which was introduced by Hu Jintao and later became part of the CCP and PRC constitutions. This is an overarching kind of global narrative, a global initiative that acts as an umbrella for all of Chinese foreign policy. It's a change from a more restrained, a more isolated China that was present at the UN in the 70s and 80s and 90s to one that is much more open. It's a very important overarching umbrella. The Belt and Road Initiative needs no introduction. I'm sure you're all very aware it's extremely important, brought about by Xi Jinping in 2013. But more recently, you have a flurry of global initiatives that have gone through just in the past few years, 3 in the same number of years. We have the Global Development Initiative, we have the Global Security Initiative, and we have the Global Civilization Initiative. And when we talk about narratives, we're understanding that these initiatives, they're underpinned by certain concepts of perhaps jurisprudence, which are discussed in Moritz Rudolph will discuss later, but also about ideas of international order, of rule of law, of what matters in all of these things. Obviously, development, security, and the idea of civilization, of person to connection. Each one of these represents one of those individually. For example, the Global Development Initiative puts forward the idea of development as a human right. The Global Security Initiative talks about rebalancing security infrastructure to avoid what's often called in Chinese press conferences bloc confrontation. The Civilization Initiative is supposed to be an appreciation of the diversity of ways of governing across the world and to emphasize the importance of people-to-people exchanges. So that's sort of the link that we make between these initiatives and their underlying concepts that really drive them. To get us straight into our Western initiatives that we used as comparison, we have PEPFAR, the U.S. Presidential Executive Program for AIDS Relief that was launched by George W. Bush in 2003, I believe, focused on AIDS relief. We have EU training missions, which are security focused, launched in 2010 in different parts of Africa. And we have the Global Counterterrorism Initiative, launched just a year later to really have not so much a military, but more of a social response to global extremism. The Global Compact for Migration, the Alliance for Multilateralism, the Global Gateway, these have been all much more spaced out. I'm very conscious of time here, but each one of them in its own way also reaffirms sort of Western notions of global governance, whether it be in the shared responsibility to deal with migration crises, whether it be to kind of present a counteroffer to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative through the Global Gateway, to counter extremism in military but also social values, and through the collective idea of public health through the initiative PEPFAR, which saw more than $100 billion funneled to different states. So when we look in a comparative perspective here, well, first we should talk about how China is becoming more comfortable bringing these initiatives to a global audience and faster. From spending years to launching and workshopping these initiatives domestically, they're now sometimes being launched right at the United Nations itself. It is definitely symbolic of how China is much more assertive in its global initiatives and more prepared to present them on a global stage, to have a global audience rather than a domestic one. When we look at the number of Chinese initiatives mentioned per year, how often we see these initiatives kind of come up in United Nations documents, we see that Belt and Road Initiative blows the rest out of the water. I mean, it is by far and away the most mentioned Chinese initiative, and you see spikes and you see dips, which are interesting to analyze in their own right. But in the recent flurry of initiatives, the most popular one has undoubtedly been the Global Development Initiative, partly perhaps because it builds on the United Nations systems of the Sustainable Development Goals. It takes the Sustainable Development Goals as its mission to achieve. It is, on the face of it, a highly, it's a strengthening force in the United Nations, or so it's promoted to be. But the other ones have gained some momentum too. We see the Global Security Initiative gaining momentum in 2022, and all of them sort of dip a little bit in 2024, although obviously the data for 2024 isn't complete yet. Western initiatives have a similar pattern of mentions, but only compared to the smaller Chinese ones. No Western initiative has gotten as much notoriety as the Belt and Road Initiative, and that's including the Global Gateway. The most famous Western initiative at the United Nations has been the Global Compact for Migration, which has gained more steam of late. But otherwise, none of them is really even close to comparing to the Belt and Road. When we carried out this large language model analysis to figure out what these things are spoken in the context of, what are the topics covered, we found that a lot of them concern security in sometimes really surprising ways. And initiatives that you would not find to be on the surface about security issues tend to actually be discussed in documents that pertain mostly to security or to human rights, and to aid. These are the three largest ones, but as you see with the pie charts here, security is a preponderance. It is, a lot of these are discussed in documents pertaining to a security lens. And we find similar but more balanced results when it comes to Western initiatives. If you look at PEPFAR, for example, this is an initiative that on the face of it is really just about antiretroviral treatments, about safe sex practices. All that you might imagine is related to HIV care. But what you really find is that there's also a lot about infrastructure. There's also a lot about other forms of aid, not just health. These are all topics that are similar to, but not exactly what you might imagine from these initiatives. And I think that's an important finding in itself. But when we look at the countries that are linked to these initiatives, a stark contrast emerges. And so when we look at countries that are mentioned, again, paragraph by paragraph, mentioned in the same exact paragraph as these initiatives, we find that China's initiatives are overwhelmingly self-referential. They really talk about themselves in the space of these initiatives rather than their partners across the world. There's exceptions to this. If you look at the Global Security Initiative, for example, you can see BRICS start to pop up on the map. You can start to see P5 countries start to be more discussed on these maps. But when you're looking, for example, at the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the most discussed Chinese initiative by a long shot, it's still mostly referring to itself in these things. And when we look at the next slide, we can see that Western initiatives are a little bit more balanced. Now, part of the reason that they appear more balanced is because they're not spoken about as much, and so there's a higher impact that these mentions have. But what you also find is that some of Europe's initiatives sort of struggle to get off the ground and become global. They really become directly linked to the countries that are most most important to the initiatives themselves. So when we look at, for example, the EU training missions, we can see the countries very clearly that involve these military training missions in Africa. And when we look at, for example, PEPFAR, we can see that a lot of the funding and a lot of the mentions were the same. The countries mentioned in the context of PEPFAR were the countries that received the most funding, were the countries that had the highest cases of HIV in Africa. It's where need was greatest. And you can draw this out for several other initiatives, but they struggle more so than the Chinese to get global and to become more mentioned, but they are more directed and less self-referential than their Chinese counterparts. So I believe it's time to switch to deeds and voting affinities, and for that I'll pass to Pauline.
Thanks a lot, Theo. So yes, indeed, next we'll just look at how over time potentially the impact of the mention of these initiatives play out in how countries actually behave at the UN. And to do that, as Theo mentioned, we studied roll call votes, so that's roll from the General Assembly of the United Nations, and we tried to compute a score to have an annually how countries vote close or not close to China, basically. And so here you have just the number of observations that we had. We decided to base our analysis from the year 2000 because this is the year that China decided to embrace the UN as somewhere to increase influence a bit more, as we showed in the first slides. And so diving into the analysis right away. So here on the left and on the right, we compare basically the alignment scores that countries display to China on the left and to the US on the right. To have more clarity of reading, we decided to group country groups according to regions. So the first thing that strikes the eye is that scores for alignment to China are systematically higher than scores for the US, basically. That the blue line on the right that you see for affinity to the US is North America, which comprises the US and Canada. So essentially, that tells us not much about the extent of American influence. And then the orange line is Europe. So Europe is closer to the US, but actually still somewhat much closer than to China that we would have first anticipated when we looked at when we first started the analysis. And then looking to the left, if you just look at the extent to which countries vote like China, what you see is that all of the lines that are bottom dot together, most of them are indeed, like Alicia mentioned, from the developing world. So maybe this kind of nourished our analysis that since we see no noticeable evolution of how these countries vote closer potentially to China over the years, maybe they were aligned in the first place, and that potentially has nothing to do with a change, a shift, or in Chinese strategy. So looking at other breakdowns, we then decided to look at important votes. Basically, the United States State Department singles out some votes that are critical for them. This is there's I think a little bit over 200 votes from the 2000 to 2017. And there what we see interestingly is that much more countries do side with the US on these important votes than we first thought. So for instance, the two lines that are the closest to the US are Europe, so that's Europe as a whole, and then EU 27. And so that would, and then all the other countries also are closer than on general votes. So that would point that the US potentially either just has a closer alignment with its interests on these important votes, or that the US engages diplomatically much more strongly on these tiny key votes. But we'll look at interesting case studies just later. And so then, we tried to differentiate votes on which the US and China acted differently or not differently. So on the left, you have all the votes where China and the US voted differently. China and the US actually votes differently on 85% of the votes. So unsurprisingly, the results are not very different from the general affinity that we saw a few slides ago. But then when we look at the votes, so those 15% votes where China and the US vote the same, the chart that you have on the right, the scores are very high for all countries. But so that potentially just points to the fact that these are non-debatable votes. There's no critical geopolitical opposition on these votes. Looking further, we wanted to look a little bit at how the EU is behaving. We also decided to break down the EU 27 into regions. This chart shows us that actually Europe does have overall quite a coherent behavior at the UN. Interestingly, when we look at actually the country breakdown, the two outliers that we found that don't necessarily appear too much on these charts are Hungary and Greece, that are the ones that are branching the most away from US votes and the closest to Chinese behavior at the UN. But overall, yes, we see that it's coherent with what we've seen before. It's behavior that is kind of similar in between US and China, and not as close to US as we first envisioned. And there we go. And then the interesting case studies, the question of Russia. Do Russia and China vote as one voting bloc at the UN? And the answer is yes and no. They vote very closely, but not at all in a systematic way that we could have first envisioned. Secondly, that's what also Alicia had hinted at the beginning, is the question of, does China just have similar interests to a large amount of countries that face the same development issues, that face the same relationship to the West historically and economically? And so we looked at the group of 77, which is basically born of the non-aligned movement, which has now grown to encompass, I'm not sure about the number, the number of countries total that is blanking. But anyhow, we can see that over the years, this group displays systematic close voting strategies to China, and this actually is decreasing since the year 2012, 2013. So again, this points to the fact that even though China is more and more present in terms of budget, in terms of personnel, in terms of narrative at the UN, influence even on the countries that vote historically closer to it does not show in the data. And then to confirm this first hunch that we had, we tried to look at it from an income perspective. So do countries that have the same GDP per capita vote the same way? And again, we have no absolute clear picture that comes out. What does appear still is that affinity to China is systematically higher than affinity to the US, that the West votes closer to the US, but other than that, there's no clear story that comes out. And then we wanted to look at two case studies of current importance, which are Ukraine and Palestine, basically, and to see how countries position themselves on these two ongoing crises. So looking at Ukraine, we took all relevant votes from 2022, from like the beginning of the invasion in February 2022 to 2024. And what we see is quite stark, opposite to the results on general votes. Alignment to the United States is very high across the board, as you can see on the left chart. And alignment to China, albeit it's growing in some regions like Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, is still much lower than overall alignment to the US in condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine. And then looking at Palestine, the interesting is that we have a flip of behavior here, is that the US is extremely isolated in its voting behavior on supporting or not condemning Israeli action on Palestine. So these are all things pertaining to Palestinian land, so Gaza, Syrian Golan, East Jerusalem, but also everything pertaining to Palestinian rights or Palestine representation at the UN. And maybe Alicia can jump in for some policy conclusions.
Okay, so maybe, yeah, I don't remember. So thanks for showing me the conclusions, but I to you and think, well, these are lots of findings, so I hope you didn't lose track of where we were heading. But I think that perhaps I should start by saying that, yes, China first is on a mission to increase its influence at the UN. We might not be necessarily showing that. We show it through the initiatives, but we rely on other sources, on budget or committees, you name it. So I think we need to start by saying China really does care about the UN, yeah? And we're trying to measure how much it has increased its influence. So the irony of our results is that it seems maybe influence is not the right word, because we can't prove influence. We just basically show either alignment, could be a correlation, because we find, say, Russia, China very high, but who starts what? Because we actually wrote a paper published here at Bruegel on, actually that's an empirical study trying to figure out why countries voted against China's aggression, Russia's aggression of Ukraine. And interestingly, we find that the most relevant variable is Russia's exports of arms. This is bilateral data, okay? So it wasn't China, it was Russia. And why do I say this? It's because we cannot really prove, okay, Russia and China are very aligned, but who starts? I mean, is it China's influence? We can't really answer that question. But what we can say is that whatever type of alignment on the voting side, on the deeds, started well before. And in the literature that I didn't review for the lack of time, there is a very relevant paper showing that trade does matter for UN voting, meaning that if you trade more, you tend to vote more aligned. If that's the case, knowing that China is now the largest trading partner of more than half of the world, we should have seen an increase. So in other words, our benchmark based on this economic literature should have been, wow, China is dominating. But we don't find that. That doesn't mean, I want to say that loud and clear, that we shouldn't just say, okay, China will never make it. That's not what we're saying. I actually think that China is pursuing many different routes to influence the UN. And we are just capturing narratives. One is working, four are not. But that doesn't mean that the one working is not the one working the most, which is what we find. BRI is working more than any other Western initiative. So it's like China, this reminds me of industrial policy, puts a lot of resources, and maybe only a few work, but they work. Yeah, it's not that everything works. A lot doesn't work according to our results. But that doesn't mean we should not worry about the ones we Europeans were putting it ourselves, with the hat of Europeans here. We shouldn't worry about those who actually work. So the finding is not conclusive, but it does show that the intent is there. It's just that it doesn't work across the board, whether it's on voting or on narratives. And I think we just need to watch and say, okay, well, how is China doing this? If this is not working, what's next? Is it standards? Is it committees? And I think for Europe, what we need to realize is that we seem to be quite aligned. Of course, Gaza is a different story. We know that. We don't even need to look at our results. But in a way, our results are confusing. For general votes, China and US are similar. For very important votes for the US, we're with the US. But we're not like anywhere, if you see what I mean. We're not anywhere. And I think that's also important. And of course, the Global Gateway compared to BRI. I mean, I know this is a recent initiative, but it does show that it's not taking off according to our results on the UN, at least in the UN. That's all from my side. I'm sorry we took much longer than expected. We now need to hear from our discussants. And I also need to hear from somebody out there what is the password for our Slido that I forgot to ask. Because people can send questions through Slido, and maybe we'll get the password. Do you know the password? Yeah, go ahead.
Is #China.
Okay. Okay, there you go. Yeah. So anybody who has questions, except here in the room, there is a premium for being here. You have please do send them, and then we start with our discussants. So we have 3 discussants for this paper, and it's not only discussing the paper, frankly. I'm sure you have much more to add than just, adding comments to our paper. So we expect much more, and we know it's coming. So we're going to start with Marine Boussoux, yeah, and Marine is policy officer at the China team at the European External Action. Then we'll have Anna Palacio and Moritz, but I'll be introducing you as we speak. Yeah, Marine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'll try to give you a little bit of analysis of how we look at China's activity at the UN, because obviously China is a partner to us, also a rival, as you know, but we value this continued engagement that we need to keep with China and cooperating with China. But it's not always easy to define on which grounds, and we need to also see at the UN what kind of initiatives China pushes to see if they really align with UN values, the UN Charter, and the principles that we uphold. So what I want to say is first to refer to your paper, Alicia and colleagues, very, very interesting. It's always very interesting to have concrete data on how much figures add up, And definitely China is making its way more and more within the UN. And as you said, they value the UN, which doesn't seem always so obvious because they criticize the rules-based international order, sometimes in a disguised way. But then they also value, and it matters to them to be well integrated, to be part of it, and to push their initiatives and to have them backed or even sometimes labeled by the UN, because they want to also, take part in the big movement and be seen as a defender of the developing world. So there are sometimes some contradictions in Chinese behavior, but what we can say is that they've been investing a lot in the UN for sure. They've been doing a great job, let's be honest, in nominating people, having a lot of Chinese officials around UN institutions and working efficiently at all levels, where sometimes some Western countries would maybe neglect some smaller or allegedly smaller organizations or agencies. So they've been quite present, and they've been also using the narrative. And what I want to say as maybe the main tactics that we've been witnessing in China's successful gathering support of the Global South, for example, is, first of all, I would say, communication, narrative comes first. Really, China is applying this technique of acting by claiming, Maybe that's a difference with our Global Gateway or any other Western initiative, that maybe we would go out and communicate a lot when it's perfect, when it's implemented, when it's done, when it's completed. And China doesn't work that way. China, as you were saying, Alicia, is throwing a lot of initiatives, throwing a lot of keywords, to make it happen somehow. It's a very performative way of working. So they very much like to count numbers, to advertise new initiatives, even before providing content. And we saw it with Global Development Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, Global Security. At first, it's just a white paper or non-paper or position paper with some very general concepts that we can't really, that everybody can really support, that it is quite reasonable and interesting, but then not much concrete content. And then it comes and it adds up, event after event. For those global initiatives, for example, they would create groups of friends, claiming, okay, we hold this event or this conference to present our new initiative, and then we have 20 friends, supporting it. And then 6 months later, you'll have this number come up to 45 friends, and then 1 year later is 80 friends. And you can notice as well, for example, each time you have a state visit to China, any country from any leader from South America or Africa would find himself signing a final communique of the visit, upholding, in one sentence, all the global initiatives. And that's one more friend, because just the fact of signing a communique saying your support, what does it really mean? We don't know. But then you know, it means from the Chinese point of view, the initiative has one more supporter. So counting numbers really matters to them, and it's a clever way of working, because then it's repeated, and everybody knows that, or kind of concludes that the initiative gets more and more popular, at least in the public speaking. For example, another quick example, the BRICS summit. So it's not Chinese initiative or whatsoever, but you know, China is of course a big actor. You could see one of the deliverables of the summit was to have some criteria defined for the partnership, how to be a partner of BRICS. So they have defined some criteria. We don't know exactly what they are, but does it really matter? For China, we believe not that much. The most important is to have a number of partners, you know. So we have 13, 14 new partners. That's good. Let's see the details later, you know. So the more people, the better it is. Also, it's quite unclear with China. They usually claim partners and try to get closer or involved in many different groups. As you were saying, Alicia, they're throwing balls in all directions without necessarily taking responsibility for their actions. You know, maintaining a careful distance and framing its relationships as non-aligned and cooperative rather than confrontational. So, of course, China is involved in many different groups, the BRICS, the SCO, and so on. I want to give a quick example about negotiations. For example, the Pact of the Future that was adopted back in September in New York in the margins of UNGA High Level Week. We could see during the negotiation, China was sometimes, you know, supporting the G77 group, sometimes a so-called group of like-minded countries led by Pakistan, depending on, you know, what vocabulary or concepts they were more in favor of supporting. But never would they go forward, you know, they would support in the backseat, you know, not going forward if a member of the group was pushing for a problematic or sensitive language, or even abstaining rather than voting against a proposal. You know, at the last minute, for example, Russia proposed something in addition to the pact, and most countries were against it, and it was very last minute, and there was this so-called motion of no action that was adopted. Whatever, it's a detail, but most Western countries voted for this no action motion, and China just abstained. You know, so it's a very blurred positioning sometimes. But what's very clear is that China is featuring itself as a defender of the developing world, and more as an honest broker, you know, peace broker. You could see in their latest position paper that they presented at UNGA again this year. China insists very much on its role in the Palestine conflict, in facilitating the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal, also its role in the Horn of Africa, and many parts of the world. They want to feature themselves as a peace broker. And of course, in Ukraine with their new initiative, Friends of Peace. So I think this is pretty new, that China is really claiming this role. And at the same time, as I was saying, not really being willing to always take responsibility for, you know, what it means. So it will be interesting to see concretely what actions China might be taking in the coming years. This leads me to talk about China's contradictions more precisely, because we see that by doing this, by speaking more and more at the UN, within UN instances and everything, China is upholding the rules-based international order and claiming to support the UN Charter and so on, system that it contributes to undermine as well. Because, and that's why sometimes China is seen as a threat at the UN, because they really are effective in appearing to be seeking consensus and to be promoting multilateralism with the UN at its core, but even when they are promoting revisionist approach. We see it with the selective approach they have of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. They always put forward, you know, the right to development before the other human rights. We see it, I mentioned it just before, with the Friends of Peace initiative. So they claim to be proposing a peace solution for Ukraine. But despite their stated opposition to building divisions, this initiative put forward by China and Brazil would in fact reward the aggressor. And this reference to respecting the legitimate concerns of the states, allegedly the legitimate security concerns of the states, this is not compatible with the UN Charter. So it tries to justify Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. So this is another contradiction, you know, putting forward the UN Charter and then not really upholding it. And to finish maybe with some examples of events, if all those initiatives don't always work, as you were saying, Alicia, don't always materialize into voting behavior, for example, it does work with UN leadership, for example, because we have more and more events that are organized, which is completely fine, you know. Every country is free to organize some side events at the UN in the margins of UNGA High Level Week or any other event to promote an initiative. But the question is how far each time the UN leadership is associated, either in the introductory remarks or as a co-host of the event. And this becomes sometimes a little bit problematic because China successfully gets the support of UNDP very often, or other instances, to co-host some events that are designed on paper, even just by reading the concept note of the event, that are designed to promote Chinese initiatives, only Chinese initiatives. I have in mind a few examples of, for example, Global Development Initiative events, GDI, Group of Friends. It's in its very title, it's an event designed for GDI projects and for the friends of this initiative. But then you have the UN co-hosting the event and doing an introductory speech. So it can be seen as problematic if not all UN countries are on board, and we should be careful about that. We have other examples of UNDP or even OECD, which China is not a member of, but is a strategic partner. So there is commitment for dialogue, and it's important. But we have OECD and UNDP who have been proposed as well to co-host an event on international development taking place soon in Beijing. And in the end, I think they're just going to be helping organizing a side event because this is then more proper, you know. So there's a fine-tuning to do here. Last example I would mention is about GDI because we've been talking about it a lot. For example, there's a new task force, also called Working Group, that has been launched by the UNSG, the Secretariat in New York, about SDGs, to facilitate Sustainable Development Goals, SDG Task Force. This was initially titled GDI Task Force, and it was proposed by the Chinese. So it was remodeled, it was, you know, transformed, and it's supposed to be today more inclusive, and it could be very interesting, though we have to make sure it really has some added value compared to the UN resident coordinator system, for example, because the UN is represented in every country where UNDP has important actions. So would there be really an added value with this new task force or working group in New York? This remains to be seen, but it's interesting. The thing is, why in a few weeks has it been changed from GDI working group to SDG working group? How? And without any internal consultation, you know, at the General Assembly. So that's also a bit of a problematic dynamic that I think from the EAS we notice and we would like to keep an eye on, because cooperation is very important, and China's contribution to achievement of the SDGs is most welcome, obviously, but then we need to make sure everybody's on board, transparency matters, and of course not having a selective approach of the SDGs as well as the other UN values matters very much to us. Thank you, Alicia. I'll remain here and then go back to questions.
Thank you very much. I think this is very interesting because it kind of points to the fact that both words and deeds, in a way, yes, they show, you know, things that are measurable. I mean, not that what you're saying is not measurable, but it's less measurable. Yeah, and I think this is a little bit what but we see that China works in a way on the sidelines of what is measurable, and that might be even very influential. So, that's what I take away from your comments, Marin, that are really welcome. So we move to Ana Palacio, my dear friend, by the way, and really, ex-Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain and affiliated now with Georgetown University.
Well, thank you. First of all, it's a fantastic policy brief. For me, there are aspects that are completely counterintuitive, so I have to review it and study it in depth, because I think that I will at least fine-tune my opinions, which are, I have been General Counsel of the World Bank Group, and this is where I have seen, many of the things that you have been debating, and I'm sure that what you will address, the approach to what the rule of law, the legal order, as a package, what we understand as a package from the Chinese perspective. So just a few comments, not the comments that I had prepared, because I think they are absolutely off the marks, but the comments that your comments suggest and what you have said here. I must tell you that from what you have said, there are certain drivers that emerge. It's development versus what? Versus human rights. It's security versus what? Versus freedom. It's it's this fact, let's put it in that the world, the Weltanschauung, the Western Weltanschauung that has inspired the UN architecture is not the only one. And what emerges is that there is a strategy to replace this, so because the three anchors from what we have, our multilateral architecture, that is the way we see the world, and this is this idea that for them narrative comes first, and then just the developments. But this in the end, it's anchored in the very well-known, I'm not an expert in China, so this is the first thing that I want to say, but it's always, you come to this idea of the student asking the master, is Confucius, what would be the first thing that you should do when you get power? Is rename things to make things correspond to reality. And this is what is behind all this. That's my first comment. There is a strategy. There is a strategy to say, the way you see the world is not the only way. Let's just put it this way. I think it goes beyond that, and this is particularly clear when you speak about the legal order, the rule of law, what we understand by rule of law. My second comment that is linked to the first is that, yes, of course, 71 is very important, but it's not the beginning. If you have read Eleanor Roosevelt's memoirs she was the head of the US delegation to the Declaration of Human Rights, to the debates. And as such, the memoirs are fantastic, because this is where you see how the different civilizational approaches to what, or countering, so debates on what was the core of this, of the San Francisco Charter and of all the architecture is there. And it's very interesting that there are few references, but there is a reference to Dr. Chan. Dr. Chan is the Chinese representative, and of course it's not the communists. It's 45. There is still not, and of course it's not 71, but it's China. And what she says, and paraphrasing, and it's not exactly, but this is the idea. And Dr. Chan came to the debate and said, you know what, our secretariat should study Confucianism to correct these visions that are extremely narrow and, I would say, one-sided. And Eleanor Roosevelt adds an exclamation mark, as if saying, ha, I mean, come on, our vision is universal, because this is what is. This is, because our vision is universal, you have the explanation of all that you have said, is that we take it for granted. This is universal. I mean, you have many instances. 2005, it's Zöllig in a meeting with the PCC saying, well, it's a moment of China just taking its part in this global order. This global order that accepts that what we say is universal is universal. This I think is something that we have to review. And if you take this approach, and I'm saying, I have had plenty of examples in practice of this, you understand many things, because besides this vision, there is a tactical approach that is unbeatable, because it will, you have said it will try 20 or 30 the approaches that are needed, understanding that there will be some that will succeed and some that will not. But it's there, and it will come back, and it will come back on a different guise. And of course, why China? Because I have followed in the last Tunga this initiative, which is why China has been so ambivalent. Because in the end, this is a Western initiative in order to save the system. To save the system, China, what wants is to give a different meaning. And in giving this different meaning, we have certain aspects. For instance, harmony. Harmony is not at all in our Western. We don't have, because for us, the collective, the group, is not the central piece in political or in legal. For China, harmony, and harmony is now in many of this. So I think that certain concepts like harmony, I have studied a bit how harmony has got into the doctrine of the United Nations. But again, this very tactically, very intelligent approach of just saying, first development. Of course, this is in the doctrine of the United Nations. And by the way, this is in the doctrine of the United Nations. If you study Article 73 of the Charter, you have this right to development versus the foremost right from the Western perspective, which is self-determination. You see how in Article 73, and by the way, there has been a couple of rulings by the Court of Justice, by the European Court of Justice in a case involving Western Sahara, where it's very interesting how the European Court acts. But this is where this tactical approach versus the strategic approach is extremely effective. And you have said it, Alicia, it's not just United Nations, it's all a universe of, I won't say parallel, other fora where they will be acting. I read your piece on the BRICS and the last meeting of the BRICS in Russia. I a bit disagree, but it's clear that they are in the BRICS. They put forward their own initiatives, and it's, in any case, it's a challenge for us to A, understand, and B, I wouldn't say exactly counter, but understand and find the right approach, because many times we don't realize what is behind. We see the tactic, and we don't see that this is part of a vision of the world that has nothing to do. I will leave it there, because I'm sure that I will want to comment on your comments, because Once a lawyer, always a lawyer.
Thank you, Anna. That was so fascinating that I forgot my mic. Here you go. It was fascinating because I think it really shows, what I call wisdom. It's really, where are we coming from, and how much it is hard to measure, because there's so much underneath that China is doing tactically, but also strategically with long-term objectives that we cannot even pinpoint. I mean, what's the next, and what's the next? And I think we miss that. But on the tactics, just something that I think, Theo, I can't remember whether you showed, but I don't know whether it was clear enough, so I just want to tell you, Anna, that on the tactics is quite clear from our analysis, because these three initiatives, China Development Initiative, Civilization and Security, all of them, especially China Development Initiative, starts with the UN. And there's a person here, Mikhail, who's our data scientist. He did an amazing work, which is not yet presented here, looking at every single media in China, Chinese media in English and Chinese media in Chinese, to find, just to show you how tactical this is, that China Civilization Initiative, all of them actually, were first mentioned in the Chinese English language media, which means it was for us, not for them. And that's why actually some of them start straight away on UN documents and are not like domestic initiatives, if you see what I mean. So this is the tactics. It's not even for China. It's for China, for China, but for the world, China's influence in the world. So that's, making up concepts that are for that purpose is something that we wouldn't do, would we? They exist for a reason, and then they go to the UN. So I think your point is absolutely well taken, and we have that little evidence there to show that indeed they were, in a way, created for a purpose, which was different than China itself. On that note, I'm going to move to Moritz Rudolf. On leave, it says here, but I'm not sure you'll clarify, at Yale Law School and a real expert on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the initiative in our results. So we're looking forward to hearing your views.
Thank you very much. So I'm wearing my Yale Law School hat today. I'm currently China Fellow at DG IDEA, but all of this here is my personal capacity as a research scholar from Yale. So first, congratulations on this great report, and thanks so much for all of this. It was already a lot of interesting inputs. So I'm going to start with one of the questions, like to what extent is this relevant that China becomes so involved within the United Nations? And one of the angles that I'll start with is the different function of the law in a Chinese context. So, like, this is a debate that is in China highly debated, how to modernize the Chinese legal system, and it is under the narrative of the socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics. You have the Xi Jinping thought on the rule of law, and with like a lot of documents that are undermining how China, outlining how China is trying to utilize the law. Here in Europe and in the West, it's mostly just reduced to, well, it's a rule by law versus rule of law debate. But for the Chinese terminology, how they use it, it's like they call it law-based governance, and I think that is a reasonable translation of the term. And we can say, so it has, like it was already mentioned to some extent, like what are the elements of this Chinese approach to law? So of course you have this Marxist tradition, which is like provides more of an instrumental function of the law as a tool to achieve the material development goals as laid out by the Chinese Communist Party. So this is quite essential. So like the law is a tool for development goals, how the CCP outlines them. So there's like no inherent value of the law per se, as you would have in a Western dialogue. In addition to this, you have like this legalist tradition. This is like a Chinese philosophical idea to have control and order in a state stemming from the Qin dynasty. And it's like catapulted to today, it's like a focus on the strict application of rules by a strong centralized state. Then you have, as mentioned, the Confucian tradition, which is just like a focus on like the population and party officials they are expected to cultivate a moral and virtuous behavior. And the fourth element that is like an inclusion of modern technology. That means on the one hand, having like regulating like emergent technologies at a really early stage, but at the same point of time, like relying on modern technology in the way, like within the judicial system, like for instance, with digitized court proceedings. And so, as was mentioned before, so this is different to some extent. Well, it's, the Chinese is quite explicit about that. They say that like concepts such as an independent judiciary and checks and balances are rejected as erroneous Western thought. And this is something what the Chinese side, they have been saying for a couple of years, but you have it now quite, well, it's an element of what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to achieve with modernizing its legal system at home, but also to say, well, this is a different thing than what the West has been doing. So it's not, like in some areas where it's useful, there's still a lot of hunger to learn. For instance, when it comes like to the extraterritorial application of the law. This is something that China is quite interested in learning from the United States, how to do this. And there's still a lot of interest in this on its pathway to become, or wanting to become a global power. So what we see is just like a wave of new legislation, a filling of regulatory gaps, clearer competences within China, and to some extent efficiency gains. So if you're not against CCP rule in China, then on your day-to-day routine, this is something that would lead to more predictability of your routines, because you just have more laws and more regulation than you had before. And the Chinese side said that by 2023, this is according to the 5-year plan to promote law-based governance in China. This is the first time they laid out such a 5-year plan. They want to establish a law-based country by 2035. So always the argument is they would say we're still in a very early stage of this, but the 2035 goal is to have like clearer competences and like a more functioning law-based country. So this is the domestic level. On the international level, it pretty much have a projection of what you have domestically. So there's like this, there's an acknowledgement of the utility of international law, and from what Xi Jinping says about this is China should utilize international law to safeguard China's sovereignty, national security, and development interest. So from the Chinese side, there's like this acknowledgement that international law is relevant, where it is like as a tool to foster China's development goals, or the goals as laid out by the CCP. And we say in practice, as was already mentioned, like a more active, a more self-confident China. We see this in the 6th Committee of the UN, where traditionally China was not that active, but like over the past couple of years, you've seen better prepared Chinese officials. Anecdotally, I was writing my PhD and being based at the UN in New York, just seeing, okay, the Chinese side on every single, even if it's a not important meeting, there will be like 3 to 5 PhD students just being there in the room with a delegation of 10 people. It was in the Trump years, so the US had maybe 1 person. The Indians maybe had 2, the Germans had maybe 2. But like from the Chinese side, you could see there's like a real willingness to engage and to just like provide more expertise of how the UN operates, especially the 6th Committee. And the element is like this, what's also provable is just like the amount of discourse power that in contested areas of international law, where China has become more able to gather majorities. So we can look at the UN Human Rights Council's voting patterns, and we see that even on issues like Hong Kong and Xinjiang, China has been able to gain majorities. When the UK and other Western countries struggle to reach countries from the global south to vote with them. So, as was mentioned also, China is strategic. And I think they're, like, if we just look what the Chinese side says, what is in the Chinese document, we get a pretty good idea of where they're going and what this idea to reshape the global order actually is, because usually there's a Chinese document that tells us all of this. So when it comes to the regulatory priorities, the Chinese side says digital economy, internet finance, AI, big data, cloud computing, technological innovation, public health, biosafety, and biosecurity. on a domestic level. And then from there, trying to set standards potentially moving forward. But when it comes to formulating international rules, from the Chinese side, what they say, they're the following key strategic fields. And those are the high seas, polar regions, cyberspace, outer space, nuclear security, anti-corruption, and climate change. So there's a clear side from the Chinese side, well, these are the areas we have identified as strategic fields, and we want to engage more in them. So then when it comes to how far have they actually, how has this worked out so far? So I think it is, we see, of course, more engagement. We see like an ambition or like an action to try to fill gray areas of international law. So for instance, when it comes like to the Antarctic Treaty from 1959, where you have like the question, to what extent is, like what kind of activities are permitted, what kind of research is permitted, what is the potential role of military there. So in the end, if you deal with China, where you have this military-civil fusion, and you have 5 research stations, some of them focusing on satellite technology. So it's quite difficult to understand, to say, to what extent is this actually within the realm of the Antarctic Treaty or not? And those are gray areas that where China is just creating facts on the ground just by its ability to act within all of those spaces that like outer space, like cyberspace, like the polar regions, and so on. So China's just becoming a relevant actor there, and they're becoming a relevant actor with good international lawyers, and with the Chinese side that actually has technological and political interests that it is following. One of the interesting parts, and I think this was also mentioned, was like the reliance or like the engagement of the Global South in building regulatory networks. So this is happening on multi-levels at the same point in time. It was the same thing for the Belt and Road Initiative. You have a strong bilateral element of this. A lot is just like bilateral cooperation between China and partner countries where there's an interest. You have the regional level, like the so-called China plus X mechanisms that you have with Africa, that you have with ASEAN, countries in the Middle East, Central Asia, and so on, where you have, well, a broad array of cooperation that is that fits into the pattern of the priorities the Chinese side is setting for itself. For instance, agriculture cooperation or health cooperation, and so on. The list, it's quite a comprehensive engagement by the Chinese side. And then the UN, that is one key element of China's pursuit to reshape the international legal order, but it's not the only one. It's just like the one where we see a lot of the abstract narratives that we can discuss. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because everybody here has already studied this, but I just want to say one thing, that when we talk about like this global community for a shared future, like Renmin Gongtongti, which is like a really difficult term to translate, like the relay part, like the mankind part, was first introduced to a global audience at the UN in 2015. So you have many communities of shared future. Originally, under Hu Jintao, it was like to describe the relationship, like the cross-strait relations between Taiwan and mainland China. And then it was just like expanded further. You have regional ones. Now you have within every single China plus X mechanism, you have a community of shared future with Middle Eastern countries, with Central Asian countries, and so on. But in 2015, when Xi introduced it to the UN, there were 5 elements, and I think this is quite relevant to see the connection between the global community of shared future as introduced in 2015 with the global initiatives. Because there were 5 elements, there were equal partnership, new security architecture, this is the global security initiative, there was common development, which is now the global development initiative, and you had inter-civilization exchanges, which is now the global civilizations initiative. They were just introduced at a later stage, and the other one is green development. We don't have a green development initiative yet, but in the end, when you see like how the Chinese policy-making apparatus functions, like having an abstract vision and having it concretized at a later stage with like feedback loops, this is nothing that is so surprising. It is just happening at this global level now with this global abstract vision that the Chinese side has with like the global community of shared future, of like having a the Chinese side says is to have an international order that matches the political reality on the ground. So then when it comes like, to the question, what does this really imply? Then it means that for a lot of those international legal standards that we have, the Chinese side argues they were a result of post-World War II, and now we are in 2024, so there is a necessity to update this to a different, like to a new level. And you can just see, like, if any of the key UN documents were to be decided today by the members of the UN, we would not get anything like the UN Charter that we have today with the states as it is today. The Chinese side, they know it. And so it's really easy to push those narratives, like with the Global Development Initiative, like the prioritization of development. This is a long-standing Chinese position that they have had and pushed with the G77 for decades. And now the difference is that it's not embedded within a strategic umbrella. This is just directed to a global audience, of course. The same thing with the Global Security Initiative. This is like China's vision of a collective security reform. But it has 6 points, and all of the 6 key elements of the Global Security Initiative, they are elements that China has been pushing for a very long time. And then we have the Global Civilizations Initiative, which is like the core narrative there is that modernization does not equal westernization. This is what the Chinese side uses, and it's like you can, of course, interpret this, but to some extent it sounds like China is, this is a way to criticize any kind of universality, because everything becomes relative, a projection of how the power relationship is, which is in line with the Chinese perception of the law. So it is, and to some extent, this narrative appears to have a couple of hundred countries who are endorsing this. And like the other initiative that we have to mention, and I'll be quick, I'm sorry for speaking too much, but this is, I think, relevant. We have the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Chinese side calls it the most comprehensive tool for building that community of shared future for me mentioned. The Belt and Road Initiative from 2013. And so there's a document that came out in 2023, which is like 10 years of the Belt and Road, and it's framed as like the tool that you use to get to this global community of shared future. And I just want to focus on the legal cooperation part of this, because this is often not focused on, because for the Chinese side, this is about network building. You build networks, and then in order to have networks, you can build standards. And part of the soft connectivity is the legal cooperation. So you have legal cooperation programs under the BRI, which aim to give like different legal traditions and legal concepts around the world validity. So you have, for instance, a Belt and Road Legal Research and Training Program, where where representatives from, for instance, for the Ministries of Justice, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they're legal, they're treaty-making people that come together, and you have like discussions on human rights, for instance. So this is something where the Belt and Road Initiative is also used as a tool to promote China's views on the law as well. And so I conclude now. So what are the implications that we see? What can we expect more from this? So first one is we'll have more Chinese international law expertise. More, and we see already like a wave of experts emerging who can face any other diplomat on a legal debate if they are, because they're really well educated, and we're just seeing the very beginning of this wave, because it's just compare this to Made in China 2025. When now we're seeing a wave of technological innovation that is just like swamping the world. Like there's like a Chinese incentive within the system to have better lawyers, better international lawyers, and this is something that the wheels are in motion for this. So the second part is like you have more engagement in international rule setting. Like we are still at a very early stage of this, but we have to understand that like the vision as outlined by Xi Jinping is like not like to have this international impact. It's just it's a very early stage of this as well. What we see there is like the promotion of foreign-related rule of law. I think we could discuss this if someone is interested in this, but this is pretty much within China the most hotly debated issue on how China is connecting its domestic legal system with the international legal system or the international rule of law. But I won't get into this now because of time constraints. Then the other element that we see is like increasing international judicial cooperation, in particular cooperation in the field of law enforcement. This is a priority area for China for a long time. You have the Clean Silk Road, there's like a subset of the Silk Road, of the Belt and Road Initiative, just focusing on law enforcement cooperation and anti-corruption cooperation. And the fifth one is like the building of a modern international dispute resolution mechanisms. Like this is something where the Chinese side, they have been announcing they will be, well, we've seen this, they're throwing their hat into the ring and saying, well, they want to play a constructive role in state-to-state dispute resolutions. So we have to see where this goes, because a lot of this is really abstract and contradictory, but we see that there's like there's a political willingness from Beijing to engage in that. And so last but not least, like with the Trump presidency, we might see a catalyst of this development, because in 2016, the Chinese side, they were not prepared to fill the vacuum of at the UN. But we can anticipate that with the United States drawing more out of the UN, that the Chinese side, like 8 years of preparation, 8 years of building expertise, like it wouldn't be a surprise if China becomes way more prepared. But, and this is the big but on this, because at the same level, China will have to reduce the level of ambiguity it relies on at the international level. And this is something, it's really easy to focus on, like fill more space in the gray areas or to criticize existing standards, but it's much more difficult to promote a consistent, clear, non-ambiguous narrative. And so far, China has not been able to do this on those abstract ideas in the UN, like the legitimate security concerns. Like the Chinese translation is, for the legitimacy means her leader, which means reasonable. Anquan. So it means the translation would be reasonable security concerns. But it's translated in legitimate security concerns with like a legal dimension to this. It's not her father, which would be like giving it some kind of a legal connotation to this. Then we have the Global Civilization Initiative. The problem is when you translate a document from Chinese into English, like do you use the singular or the plural form when it's like not clear? So they use the singular one, Civilization Initiative, which of course, when you know there's like a global debate about this, there's a difference if you call it Civilization or Civilizations Initiative. And on those like basic things, like the Chinese side appears to be still at the very early stage to have like to reduce this level of ambiguity. But I'm quite sure this will be this will be facing a lot of people working on this in the years to come, and I'm absolutely certain that we're just seeing the very beginning of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Moritz. Wow, this was quite something. Let me. I leave 2 questions. You don't need to answer now because we need to take questions from the floor. But just if China manages under Trump, maybe they need a third Trump, but that might not or might happen. We don't know yet. Under Trump, if they're ready to reduce the level of ambiguity, i.e. make proposals, not just, stop proposals or actual proposals for change on the on a legal basis, I'm curious to hear, your redevelopment. You immediately said, post World War II world. Is that the redevelopment? Is that the redevelopment? I mean, what that is. And then I think what you said about legal cooperation under BRI, it sounds like, where's the common law? I mean, like, it all sounds like a new, signified, if I may, international legal framework. I mean, I'm pushing the argument, but I'm saying, will this all come together, in these difficult times under Trump for the UN? And finally, what you said about extraterritoriality. I mean, if you put all of this together, it's like, so keep it there. You'll have, because we're going to gather questions. I have a problem, which is that I didn't get any questions, which doesn't mean that there are no questions. So while we see the questions, hopefully on the screen, maybe anybody has a question on the floor? Yeah, Ignacio and Romina. Yeah, let's.
It's more like an hypothesis that can be tested try to understand a bit better the voting patterns. I wonder whether it might not be useful if you're going to deepen the reflection to distinguish a bit more between two types of votes in the UN. Development-related votes, which are mostly second committee votes, human rights-related votes, which are mostly third committee, human rights council votes. And two periods, let's say 1992 to 2008, 2015, and 2015 to today. Because my impression is if you look into development votes, the main driver for those votes is not China. It is the developing countries. And it is something which comes already from the days of the new international economic order. So basically there China is just maintaining the traditional joint position with the G77. So there's nothing very new in terms of the Chinese influence. And there it will be interesting to see, has this changed since China became more active in the UN in 2015 or not? Because what I found a little bit counterintuitive is that you said that there was less alignment of the G77 in the recent years, which I would not really, it's not clear why, so that would be interesting to understand. Then if you go into human rights vote, there I think you can assume that there, yes, China is probably the main driver, not the only driver, but the main driver of the agenda. Although it depends again what votes you are talking about. If you are talking about very important votes for China, then clearly how far China is getting more support in the Human Rights Council will be a very important parameter. If you get into issues like the right to development, there China is really building upon, again, a developing country narrative. It's not something that China has invented, but the idea of the primacy of the right to development has been a traditional position of many countries in the G77. So China is using this very strategically, very intelligently, but it is building upon a narrative that was already there. So I think that might be interesting as you deepen the reflection to understand how far it is really China who is getting more influence, mainly in the Global South, because I think that's really their objective, to get as much support as possible in the Global South. And in a context in which Trump is going to be moving back away from the UN, this can only increase.
Ignacio. For the interest of time, I'm going to gather a few more questions. So I hope you remember what the questions are, and then we'll take a round. Romina.
Just a very brief comment. I don't know if I need...
Yes, sorry.
Just a very brief comment. First, thank you very much. It's going to be great to read this in depth, and thank you for the discussion. And I was quite impressed by the difference of sort of wisdom position and institutional position. Sitting here in Brussels, I would be very careful saying that China is acting by claiming, and that China is, it's basically all performative. Because this very phrase, I think, would be describing European Union if you would ask Global South countries. So I think we have to be really focusing on facts on the ground. And I will just tell you one little piece from the African Youth Survey, which asked the age between 18 to, I think, 27. By 2030, this age group in Africa will comprise 1/3 of the decision makers in the world, or generation from which decision makers will come. 76% of them are saying that China is having the most influence and is the leader. So in 10 years' time, the generation that is growing up now will already be molded along what I think Anna was talking about.
Thank you, Romina. So I'm going to follow at least the order I saw. So we have this lady there, and then the lady on the back, and then, yes, and then you. And I think there's one more. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Elizabeth, and I'm coming from a corporate sector, and it's a fascinating study about the voting pattern. As you anticipate, or according to the study and the speakers, U.S. creating a gap. I believe it's not only UN, overall in international organizations. where do you see the European Union and its member state is going to go closer? Does it necessarily mean that it's going to go? We are going to go closer to Chinese decisions, or do you expect any other emerging leaders within the European Union?
Thank you. So there was a lady at the back. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Selena. I'm a research assistant at the Institute for China-Europe Studies. And first of all, I wanted to thank you all for this very interesting event. And my question pertains to the Trump presidency. You mentioned it earlier that under Trump it's going to be probably a more isolationist foreign policy for the US. And in that case, where the US presence in the UN decreases, and which would maybe impact the voting pattern in the UN, is it possible that this has an impact on China's relation with the European Union at the UN and other global stage about the policies being discussed and on which topic it might impact it, and if this would have an impact in general on China-Europe relations, especially in regards to international law and trade, as the US maybe won't be there anymore as another actor participating in the talks, especially in Taiwan, China, and other issues taking place like Ukraine-Russia war, and also the Gaza-Palestine one, in which both China, the US, and the EU are involved in the talks. Thank you very much.
There were two more questions, I believe, and then we'll, so there you go. And then you first, and then one at the end. I think that was the order.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. Actually, I'm also Yang Li from the same organization, Institute of China-Europe Studies. I have two questions. One is to the authors of this very excellent, interesting policy brief. So in your mind, what is the most prominent indicator for assessing a country's influence in the United Nations? Because I read a lot of statistics and diagrams, but yeah, I just want to be more clear about, in your view, what is the most prominent indicator to assess? And another question is to Marine from EEAS. I think it is generally accepted that both EU and China support multilateralism. So in this regard, will multilateralism, or including UN affairs, will be a platform on which China and Europe can work together, especially under upcoming Trump presidency? Or it is a place we can see there are more divisions between China and the EU, because China is always regarded as a revisionist power toward global order. So that, if there are any differences, so what are those differences coming from? And if it is due to some lack of communication, so how to improve that communication from both sides? So that's my question. Thank you.
Question at the end, the gentleman at the end. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I was in Beijing last week discussing with CASSI, Chinese Academy of Social Science, the idea of the nation, a word which was more or less growing in Europe and has a very European history, and it's difficult to translate into Chinese characters even for the Japanese. And I wonder how these initiatives, calling themselves civilization now, is showing that China sees itself already as a regional representative to the world. Looking at the economic integration now as well, RCEP, ASEAN plus 6, ASEAN plus C, and all these developments where China is very strong. Is China on the way now to represent a region more than just a nation? Because they know that the nation as such has in Europe more and more now a very reductive character. And I think it's a problem for the West entirely, including Brexit, Trump, and so on. Thank you.
So maybe a couple of questions more from the Q&A, and then we take a round. So the first question is, China's own vision of a world differ from the West, but should it really be always perceived as threatening? Should we make space for it? Yeah. And the second is, what does China expect from the UN? So these are the two questions online. And I think the best thing we could do is just to have a round of, you take the question you like, it's easy. We're not going to pose a question on anybody, so maybe some will not be fully answered, but please, the floor is yours.
So just to get us started about the chief way to have influence at the United Nations, I think an important finding at this study is that though global initiatives are important and can become a great way to kind of, they have lots of notoriety and are spoken about quite a bit and sometimes even come along with a great deal of funds and engagement. They're not necessarily the most impactful way to influence the United Nations. In our literature review, what we covered were stuff like budgetary contributions, both mandatory assessed contributions that go up in line with a country's GDP until you reach a maximum of 22%. And then also your voluntary contributions, which a lot of UN agencies run off of voluntary contributions. And so they're very important. China's assessed contributions are now quite high, about 15%, but its voluntary contributions are quite low. Another way that you can influence the United Nations is through personnel, which we all spoke about quite a bit. And that staffing of positions is very important. China has led the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations for a long time. It led the World Health Organization for a long time, although not anymore. It now leads the FAO, I can't remember what, Food and Agriculture Organization. And so it's another way to influence the United Nations. The last way is also through armed forces contributions, where UN armed forces are, not is, they are sort of created by member states. And so the United Nations needs countries to give donations of their personnel, police officers, peace officers, and equipment, which China provides a great deal of. These are all very important ways to influence the United Nations. And the last one is coalition building, where I think an important conclusion of this study is that the United Nations is no longer the only, maybe it never was, but it's definitely no longer the only institution of multilateralism that has force in the world. And perhaps it's not even the main leader of these. China's involved in so many different international organizations that it has either created or leads. I'm thinking of the Belt and Road Forum, the 中非合作论坛, the China-Africa Commission, the 中东合作论坛, the Middle Eastern one, and then there's also the Association of Islamic States that China actually sends some observers and representatives to work at as well. These are all incredibly important, and I think that's something we need to keep in mind in looking at the United Nations. It may no longer be the center of global governance.
Thanks. Just to build on what Theo just said, completely agreed that there's, as we said several times, numerous channels to influence, and that when we look at China, influence is growing on many of these channels if we look at personnel, contributions, and words. But actually, when we look at it compared to other G7 countries, compared to other members of the UN Security Council, China is on par or still way below. So what we were trying to say is that since around the year 2000, China has realized that the UN could be a platform of interest for it. Someone asked, what does China expect from the UN? I think what it expects is indeed a lot of coalition building and also a platform of legitimization of its existence, of its action, of also managing to expand in the way it does want to. But when we look at the extent to which China has important personnel, when we look at the extent to which China tries to influence, it's still much below the fact that it is the second biggest contributor to the UN after the US, because of its sheer size. So when we compare to a country like France or other European countries who have a lot more key personnel at the UN, so historically and de facto a much stronger stronghold at the UN, on the UN and how it is run, China is still behind. And then you asked about China and the G77, that I mentioned that alignment is decreasing. Indeed, that is what appears in the data, but this should not be perceived necessarily as a long trend of depreciation. The alignment is still very close over time and far away from other countries. Although, as was mentioned also by other speakers, China is not officially part of the G77. It's China, the G77 and China on the side, and there's a strategic choice in this of also mentioning its independence in voting as it plays out. If you want to take a few questions.
Okay, well, first, I think that we have to understand that the world has changed, that we have an architecture that represents power, because power is behind all this. Us, and us Europeans in particular, we try to isolate, to create a clean space for law. And law is self-contained, but law, behind the law there is always power. And of course, the architecture of 45 has been great, has served the world, and China is one of the highest beneficiaries of this multilateral architecture of 45, of Bretton Woods, of the San Francisco Charter. But the world has changed, and we have to understand that power has changed. It's as simple as that. And I think that the relationship between power and law is now surfacing. And this is something that for Chinese culture, because China is not a nation, China is much more than a nation. You cannot equate China to a nation. I think that we have to understand this relationship between power and the legal. This is my first comment. We have to be realistic. In the end, this the Paris 15, the Paris Agreement or the Paris. This is very telling of the world changing, and today we have it in much clearer way. And there, China already just weighed in, and the Paris Agreement is not legally binding. We Europeans, we fought for it legally binding, because what we understand is legally binding, because we are legally binding. We are by law and of law. What are we seeing today is that legally binding is not any longer what it used to be. From the way our member states act, even in areas that are the realm of the European Commission, where we have surrendered our sovereignty. And a very telling case is just the EVs with China. The EVs with China, the member states had nothing to do. This is a trade. This is trade law, and this is communitarized, but it's there. So I think that realistically, we have to understand and to establish a dialogue that is going to be very difficult, because, of course, the Chinese building blocks are very different from the blocks we used to build this multilateral system. There was another the EU. I mean, this is the corporation, this lady that was there. That you ask, EU corporations, you see it, because you see this, how law and power play in a very clear way. Now, on the influence of China in Africa, this is a much longer conversation. I don't agree with this. I think for us, Westerners, we are creating a self-fulfilling prophecy in saying that the BRICS are going to China, that the Global South is going to China. It's not. I think that there are certain building blocks that we promote. The role of the individual, that is there, is in Latin America. Again, I don't want to bring, but history is very telling. If you read the memoirs, again the memoirs are very telling. The memoirs of Keynes. Keynes was the head of the British delegation in the Bretton Woods. And there you see how Latin America brought forward certain of this development. For instance, Latin America with China in an interesting dialogue. So what I think is that we have to understand that in this new world, we Westerners, we have to get into dialogues mostly with China, but also with the global South. I mean, this is brush strokes. We have to get into a dialogue standing by our principles, because this is no relativism. I mean, for me, I think that this relativistic idea of on the one hand, on the other hand, and everything is equivalent is a loser of a strategy for us. On the contrary, I think that we have to be very clear about what are the building blocks, what for us is really fundamental, and then be able to dialogue in the rest. And it's not going to be easy, but there are elements there.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with the question, what does China expect from the UN? I think to some extent they expect legitimacy for their rise, pointing to that the majority of states, or a great majority of states, is supporting them. So, but I think a lot of this is about the optics rather than the true power to actually reshape the global order and the international legal order. I think that, and we see this, we saw it similarly within the Belt and Road Initiative, you have like this shift, I think you mentioned this as well, to like those China plus X mechanisms. So, and if you just go through the different agenda items that are being discussed in like the China Arab States Cooperation Forum, China Latin America Cooperation Forum, you have pretty much the same agenda items, but it's always like in a China plus X context. So it's not within the UN context, but it's just like you have like those smaller circles with whom you're discussing health cooperation, what could be discussed within the WHO, or agriculture cooperation that could be discussed within the FAO, and so on. So this is something that for the Chinese, this is still really relevant to have the UN for those legitimacy reasons, but I think from the Chinese side, they are aware that it's highly unlikely to have really fundamental resolutions happening out of the UN that would lead to a reform of it. So it's easier for them, it's really low cost to say, well, we want to reform, we want to play a role within, but in the same point of time, like the real costs from the Chinese side to engage with them, they're not that high. And we see this in practice, that quite often China is very good at labeling, and then of course they're also playing within the UN, but to some extent it is not as much as they say what they're doing. When you look into budgets, for instance, when you look into like their voluntary contributions, this was already discussed. So I think from the Chinese side, there's a really strategic approach to the UN and knowing what you can get out of it, low costs, but potentially high result. So on the other parts, like legal cooperation within the Belt and Road Initiative. So this has been going on since 2018. And it first started focusing on like dispute resolution mechanisms, and we have those mechanisms now. But in the end, when it comes to really the like Chinese courts applying international law, or actually dealing with like a contract between two countries outside of China who actually decide on applying Chinese law, this is still quite low, but there's like a slight increase. But I think this is not the game changer what maybe at the very early stage people could have thought this might develop into. So there's more of a focus on anti-corruption cooperation. It's called the Clean Silk Road. So this is mostly focusing on like cooperation between law enforcement agencies, and maybe trainings of police, and like stuff of this is predating the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's just like put into under a strategic umbrella there. But at the same point of time, like in 2019, you had a sub-forum on legal cooperation at the Belt and Road Forum, and And the British, someone from the UK said, well, when it comes to what kind of legal, how would you utilize the law? Well, there's a Chinese Hong Kong, there's like maybe some kind of an obvious candidate to from the legal sphere to serve like a mediating force, but of course this was rejected. Like the Chinese side, they did their own thing. Extraterritoriality, just really quickly, but it's quite interesting that well, now since I think 2019, you have more and more laws that have a clause of the extraterritorial application of a certain law. Like in the Hong Kong national security law, you have this in Chinese tax law, you have this in all kind of national security legislation, and a lot of the like cyber security issues as well. So, but in the end, what is quite interesting, like the Chinese academic debate about extraterritoriality is pretty much, and there's some studies on this, it's just like how is the United States doing it, and how can China follow suit without having the dollar? And so in the end, you have like one area where China is trying to pursue the United States, but its ability to really enforce its law that are this is still will be quite difficult for China, but they're focusing on this. Okay, sorry. That's okay. Thank you. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
Is it working? Yeah. Okay, I'll try to be quick on maybe the main question around here, and that also mirrors the one online about this question of vision of the world, you know, the West versus China, which is best, or which one should be put forward? Can China and Europe work together, or should we praise for more divisions? No one. I mean, more divisions is profitable for no one, and there's no point in upholding that. So, of course, China and Europe should be working together in the multilateral fora. The thing is, we need to make sure this happens on which grounds. We need to check on which grounds. And I think what we need, because Mr. you were asking, what should we do when we prepare this cooperation, when we work on it together? I think first, the important thing would be to have more transparency. I was just quickly referring the other day, just a few minutes ago, on this GDI task force thing. What happened is that, you know, we had this GDI task force proposed by China in the first place with some terms of reference. Then it disappears and it comes back labeled differently, SDG task force, with the same terms of references, not shared, not negotiated together with the other UN member states, and presented in the first place, even with this new label, in a group of friends, which is a limited group of UN member states, not all UN General Assembly. And then, of course, it has been validated and presented by the Secretariat. But why does it have to be presented first in a subgroup? Doesn't really make sense. We could have just discussed those terms of reference altogether. For example, it's just one example of more transparency, and then, of course, work together efficiently within this task force if it has good things to bring. And the second point would be, what else should we do? Agree on common values. Of course, China and Europe can work together on new initiatives, new ideas and programs when there are new things to do and to create. But there's one thing we should keep in mind, and as a reference, is the UN Charter, which is there to protect the rights of the peoples and the nations. You know, this has to remain our compass and define the criteria along which we work together. For example, we cannot accept relativity of concepts, like relativity of human rights, as you were reminding Moritz. For example, if I read just an excerpt of the Chinese concept paper that they presented, position paper, that they presented in September, it clearly says that UN human rights bodies are an excuse to interfere in internal affairs, you know, and human rights should be a platform for dialogue, not a place for confrontation. Above all, human rights should be advanced in light of national realities. This is not, this doesn't fit with UN Charter. So this is building relativization of UN values is not something we can accept. Also about the Ukraine conflict, I've already said it, the peace plans that can be proposed, they need to build on UN Charter. They need to recognize Ukraine's right to self-defense. We cannot go forward with various options and initiatives that don't go back to that as a core reference. When we have UNCLOS rulings, for example, we need to respect them. This is common references. Of course, based on that, Europe and China can cooperate. And last thing I may add is we can always do more. Like we've been recently, China has been recently saying more that they want to do a lot on humanitarian aid, that they're doing more and more. I'm not sure the figures show, and also you were mentioning China's assessed contributions at the UN have increased a lot for sure, but then China's voluntary funding seems for now quite limited. You know, the EU and its member states and the USA account for almost half of the total UN funding, voluntary, whereas I think China's share is around 3.5%. So it's also an area we could maybe work together more, and why not talk together about reform of the UN system, reform of the UNSC. We're open to discuss that, and I don't know if there are concrete proposals on the other side, but yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we need to close this and we have a closing speech. I just want to say one word. To the point of what China wants from the UN, just, what was the word? Legitimate. That sounds, just a comment, and I leave it there, quite limited for the amount of resources and even the time we spend writing this paper. What I'm trying to say is that I doubt that it is just legitimacy, but I leave it there. I can't prove it, but you know, hearing what we have had to say for 2 hours, I actually think that it is much more, and it goes into, unfortunately, or fortunately, but maybe unfortunately for the West, fortunately for others, a real change of the global order. And I leave it there. Jean-François.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you very much for this wonderful paper, presentation, policy brief. And
I'm really, really impolite because I didn't introduce you, sorry. So, you know, it sounds like, okay, so for anybody who, Jean-François is the director of Asia Center and in Paris, and we're all actually part of a consortium doing research for 3 years on China, financed by the European Commission. I should have said that. I don't know whether I did. So, Jean-François, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction as well. Yes, indeed, and I had quite a few points, and I will try to summarize what I gather from what we heard in less than the 4 points I initially had. So thank you again for the policy brief, which was summarized. Thank you to the panelists. We all learned a lot today. I think it's a topic which is full of ambiguities, and this is what I think we come back home with a conclusion that, of course, we address many ambiguities. Some of them, because you mentioned China and Africa, we are also finding in the paper that we will soon be released, written by one of our researchers at Asia Center, related to the influence of Chinese debt owed by African countries to China, and the influence on their votes at the United Nations instances. So I think we cross some of our concerns and some of the discussions which are taking place. That was my first point. I think this is very complementary to what we heard today, and the paper will be soon released, and I think will match very much with some of the conclusions and some of the observations which were made today. My second point about the ambiguities that we are all facing here is, at the end of the day, and I think that was mentioned several times, we speak about a place, a country, a nation, whatever we call it, which is built in a very hierarchical way domestically, and has to deal, when it comes to the United Nations, with something where votes are important. So one of the ambiguity is that we are observing the way that, of course, China is swaying or influencing, or maybe not swaying votes in an institution which is by essence democratic. We may imagine that at this juncture the Chinese model is not strong enough, that the concept of swaying votes or influencing votes is secured enough, and that's probably the reason why we see some ways around by China to influence, because there is a big contradiction between the way the country is run domestically and the challenge that China has to face when it comes to be included in the concert of nations, as we used to say. But that also is, and this is my third point, leads us to look at what is probably built in, I wouldn't say Chinese mentality or Chinese leaders thinking, but the concept which was elicited several times today, the concept of the organization of the world, not necessarily as a world where nations compete or cooperate, but a concept where the world is organized as Tianxia. And Tianxia is something which is gradually organized around a center with margins, and the center is probably designed to grow and grow and grow and incorporate a bigger portion of the world. That's probably what's built in the leaders' mentality, and probably what creates the difficulties we have to explain, understand the way China behaves and the way it finds some difficulties sometimes to influence or to have its own way. Having said that, the Tianxia concept, in what I understand from it, does not necessarily include crisis. And also one of the issues which also is difficult for us to understand is how China would behave or is behaving in front of crisis. We have crises around the world, and the world is changing, as you said. The big question is, how much is China able to drive and not necessarily influence or elicit? And this possibly is not totally included in the philosophy of Tianxia. So I think this is also a challenge to China. And this is my fourth point, because we have to come to recommendations. If China has challenges because of its own built-in construction of the global organization, if China has some difficulties maybe matching its own institutions, we have to remember that not only BRI, but also Shanghai Cooperation Organization, also the BRICS, are organizations which might compete or cooperate. We don't know yet, and we don't know exactly what is the longer term aim for China. So the fourth point should be recommendations. I think the fourth point is related also to what we observe in the conclusions of the policy brief and what was presented, is that at the end of the day, the field that China is gaining is not necessarily gaining momentum. And if we compare to the humble or modest inroads that the West is doing by its own initiatives, at the end of the day, well, it's not a match, it's not an even game, but I think the West still has some chances to play a role, probably with a concept of being more inclusive and using a vocabulary, because today was a lot about the vocabulary, a vocabulary which possibly would be less conflictual, more inclusive, and possibly closer to what the Tianxia concept involves. I think it's a big challenge because this is not our frame of mind, but this would be my recommendation, trying to find an inclusive way of thinking the geopolitical organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-François. That was excellent. We're 5 minutes late. I'm really sorry for the delay, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you.